The alarm doesn't make a sound. Your eyes simply open in the darkness, 3:47 glowing red on the bedside clock. You lie there for a moment, that familiar weight settling into your chest, the one that says you won't be falling back asleep. Not tonight. Not again. You reach for your phone, scroll through nothing. The blue light washes over your face in the pre-dawn stillness, and somewhere deep in your hypothalamus, something shifts. A signal misfires. A hormone stutters in its release. A clock gene falls out of rhythm, with the world turning outside your window. You don't know it yet, but the day is already decided. Not by the alarm that will sound in 2 hours, not by the breakfast you haven't chosen yet, or the workout you may or may not complete. The day is decided now, in this moment, in these stolen hours of fitful half-consciousness, by processes that began the instant your sleep fractured and failed to complete what it started. Your body is running calculations you'll never see, programming outcomes you won't understand until you're standing in front of the fridge at 3 in the afternoon, hand hovering over the leftover pizza, wondering why today feels different, why willpower feels like trying to run underwater, why the same breakfast that satisfied you yesterday leaves you hollow and searching 2 hours later. The truth is uncomfortable and elegantly simple. Sleep doesn't just affect your energy, or your focus, or your mood. Sleep decides, with biochemical precision, whether you will burn fat or store it, whether you will feel satisfied or ravenous, whether your body will treat food as fuel or threat. These decisions happen in darkness while you're unconscious, through mechanisms so deeply integrated into human physiology that fighting them feels like fighting gravity itself. This is After Dark, and tonight we're going to understand why the metabolic trajectory of your entire day is set before your feet ever touch the floor. Why sleep isn't just rest. Why it's the most powerful programming system your body possesses. And why every attempt to optimize diet, exercise, or willpower is built on sand if the foundation of sleep is compromised. Let's begin with what happens in the hours you can't remember. The overnight program. Consider what your body knows that you don't. Right now, as you read this, your cells are operating on instructions that were written hours ago. Instructions coded during sleep. Instructions that will govern every metabolic decision you make today, whether you're aware of them or not. We think of metabolism as something we control. We eat this, burn that, make choices, exert discipline. But that's surface-level thinking. Beneath conscious awareness, your body runs a deeper program, one that operates on biological cycles that respond to patterns of light and dark, activity and rest, feeding and fasting. Your body knows day from night. It knows feast from famine. It knows when it's time to build and when it's time to burn. Sleep is when these programs update, when the code refreshes, when your body recalibrates its relationship with energy, with hunger, with the very chemistry of transformation. Research from the University of Chicago and multiple laboratories studying sleep restriction has demonstrated something remarkable. When healthy individuals have their sleep reduced from 8 hours to 4 hours per night for just 6 days, their glucose tolerance decreases by 40%. That's not a small shift. That's not fatigue, making it harder to resist a cookie. That's your body fundamentally changing how it processes energy at the cellular level, changing its basic metabolic operating system based on the information it received during those abbreviated nights. The same research found that this change manifested before subjects even got out of bed. Morning fasting insulin levels increased while glucose levels remained unchanged, indicating that the body was already working harder, already struggling with insulin sensitivity, already setting up a day of metabolic disadvantage before breakfast was even considered. This is the first revelation. Sleep doesn't just affect how tired you feel. Sleep rewrites the metabolic rulebook every single night. The Hormone Conference. Think of sleep as a nightly conference where all your metabolic hormones gather to receive their instructions for the following day. Leptin sits at the head of the table, the satiety signal, the voice that's supposed to tell your brain when enough is enough. Ghrelin stands in the corner, hungry and insistent, the appetite stimulator that should only speak when fuel is genuinely needed. Cortisol waits near the back, that stress hormone that also happens to control how your body accesses its energy stores. Growth hormone moves through the room like a sculptor, deciding what gets built, what gets preserved, what gets broken down for parts. These hormones have a conversation every night, and the quality of your sleep determines whether that conversation is coherent or chaos. Studies examining sleep restriction have shown that after just 2 nights of 4 hours in bed, leptin levels drop by 18%. Simultaneously, ghrelin levels surge upward by 28%. Let that sink in. Your satiety signal decreases by nearly a fifth, while your hunger signal increases by more than a quarter. Not because you ate differently, not because you exercised less or more, simply because sleep was insufficient. But here's where it gets interesting. These hormonal changes don't just happen. They're accompanied by something visceral and undeniable. In the same studies, participants reported a 23% increase in hunger, with leptin levels serving as a significant predictor of how hungry they felt. More striking still, their cravings shifted. They didn't just want more food. They wanted specific food. High carbohydrate options, sweets, salty foods, starchy comfort. The kind of food that delivers fast energy and activates reward centers in the brain. Craving for salty foods alone increased by 45%. This isn't about willpower. This is about chemistry. Your body, operating on insufficient sleep, is quite literally broadcasting a different message about what it needs. The signal from your fat cells, leptin, is telling your brain that energy stores are low, that you're in a state of famine, that you need to eat now and eat abundantly despite having consumed the same amount of calories as when you were well rested. Meanwhile, ghrelin is amplifying that message, creating a sense of urgency around food, making every food cue more salient, every advertisement more compelling, every passing bakery a gravitational force. The University of Chicago researchers noted something particularly striking. The magnitude of leptin decrease in sleep-deprived individuals was comparable to what occurs after 3 days of consuming 900 fewer calories per day. Think about that. Your body, after poor sleep, is signaling famine in the midst of plenty. It's responding to 2 nights of bad sleep, as if you'd been drastically under-eating for 3 days, even though your caloric intake remained constant. This is metabolic programming. This is your body deciding, based on the quality and duration of sleep, what the caloric needs and hunger drives should be for the following day. And it's making that decision without your input, without your awareness, based purely on biological signals that emerge from the sleeping state. The brain's decision engine. But hormones are only half the story, because even if leptin is low and ghrelin is high, you still have a brain. You still have the capacity for choice, for override, for saying no to that craving. Right? In theory, yes. In practice, sleep deprivation disables the very machinery that makes that override possible. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, used functional magnetic resonance imaging to scan the brains of 23 healthy young adults after both a normal night's sleep and a sleepless night. They showed participants images of 80 different foods ranging from fruits and vegetables to cookies and pizza, asking them to rate their desire for each item. What they found was stark. After sleep deprivation, activity in the frontal lobe, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex and the lateral orbitofrontal cortex, areas responsible for complex decision-making, rational evaluation, and impulse control, was significantly decreased. These are the regions that help you consider consequences, weigh options, make plans that extend beyond immediate gratification. At the same time, activity in the amygdala, the deeper, more primitive structure involved in emotional processing and reward salience, was significantly increased. The scientists described it as a shift in the brain's power structure. The thoughtful, deliberative, planning parts of the brain were muted. The reactive, emotional, reward-seeking parts were amplified. The result was predictable. Sleep-deprived participants showed a significant increase in their desire for high-calorie foods. Not just a little more interested, significantly more drawn to foods most capable of triggering weight gain. And here's the critical detail. The magnitude of this shift, the extent to which individuals favored high-calorie options after sleep deprivation, correlated directly with how sleepy they reported feeling. The more severe the subjective experience of sleep loss, the stronger the pull toward calorie-dense, reward-rich food. This wasn't about education or knowledge. These were healthy, young adults who understood nutrition. They weren't confused about which foods were healthier. They simply couldn't resist as effectively when their prefrontal cortex was operating at reduced capacity, and their amygdala was hypersensitive to reward cues. One of the researchers noted something profound. When you're well-rested and you see a candy bar, you can control your natural response. But when you're sleep-deprived, your hedonic drive for certain foods gets stronger, and your ability to resist them is impaired. So you're more likely to eat it, even though nothing about the candy bar changed, even though nothing about your knowledge of nutrition changed. What changed was the balance of power in your brain. This is programming at the neurological level. The night you slept poorly, set up a day where your brain's decision-making architecture is structurally different. Less equipped to resist. More primed to pursue immediate reward. The day's food choices were decided in darkness. The insulin equation. Now let's talk about insulin sensitivity, because this is where the metabolic consequences of poor sleep become inescapable. Insulin is the key that unlocks your cells to allow glucose entry. When insulin sensitivity is high, your cells respond readily to insulin's signal. Glucose moves efficiently from bloodstream to cell. Energy is utilized properly. Fat storage remains balanced. When insulin sensitivity is low, when cells become resistant to insulin's message, everything shifts. Your pancreas has to produce more insulin to achieve the same effect. Glucose lingers in the bloodstream longer. Your body begins favoring storage over burning. The metabolic efficiency that makes fat loss possible starts to crumble. Sleep restriction, even brief sleep restriction, tanks insulin sensitivity. Studies using the gold standard measurement technique, the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, have shown that 1 week of 5 hours per night sleep reduces insulin sensitivity by approximately 25% in healthy young men. 1 week, not months of chronic sleep deprivation. 7 nights of insufficient sleep fundamentally altered how efficiently these individuals could process glucose. Other research found that after just 4 nights of restricted sleep, healthy subjects needed 30% more insulin to achieve the same glucose disposal as when they were well rested. Based on measurements of insulin secretion and glucose clearance, their bodies had to work approximately 1/3 harder to accomplish the same metabolic task. Even more striking, studies that suppressed slow-wave sleep, that deep, restorative stage of sleep, without reducing total sleep time, found that 3 nights of disrupted deep sleep decreased insulin sensitivity by 25%. It wasn't just about hours in bed. It was about quality, about actually completing the sleep architecture that allows metabolic recalibration to occur. The mechanism isn't entirely understood, but research suggests multiple pathways. Sleep restriction increases evening cortisol levels, and elevated cortisol is known to promote insulin resistance. Sleep loss also appears to increase sympathetic nervous system activity, that fight-or-flight state, which diverts energy away from anabolic, building processes toward catabolic, breaking down processes. Free fatty acid levels in the blood increase during sleep deprivation, particularly at night when they should be declining, and elevated fatty acids in the bloodstream are directly associated with reduced insulin sensitivity. Perhaps most fundamentally, sleep disruption may affect clock genes at the cellular level in metabolic tissues like the liver, muscle, and fat cells. These peripheral clocks help regulate when cells should be receptive to insulin, when they should be taking up glucose, when they should be releasing stored energy. Based on what we observe in both animal and human studies, when sleep fails to properly synchronize these clocks, the entire temporal coordination of metabolism becomes misaligned. The result is a body that, come morning, is fundamentally less capable of managing the glucose from breakfast, less capable of efficiently storing it as glycogen in muscle and liver, more likely to convert excess glucose into fat, more likely to experience blood sugar swings that drive cravings and energy crashes later in the day. This metabolic disadvantage was programmed overnight. The insulin resistance that makes fat loss harder wasn't caused by poor food choices during the day. It was set up by poor sleep the night before. The overnight shift. But let's rewind even further. Let's go back to the actual act of sleep itself, to what's happening in your body during those hours of unconsciousness, because understanding this reveals why sleep isn't just preparation for the day. Sleep is when some of the most important metabolic work actually happens. Your body, during sleep, is extraordinarily active. It's repairing tissue, consolidating memories, regulating immune function, and critically for our purposes, it's burning fat. During the early part of the night, as you sink into sleep, your body is still primarily using glycogen, those stored carbohydrates in your liver and muscles, as its fuel source. But as the night progresses, as glycogen stores gradually deplete during this extended fast, your metabolism shifts. It begins relying more heavily on lipolysis, the breakdown of fat cells. Free fatty acids are released from adipose tissue. They're metabolized for energy. Your body, quite literally, is burning fat while you sleep. Research using indirect calorimetry, which measures the respiratory exchange ratio to determine what fuel sources the body is utilizing, has shown this metabolic transition clearly. The respiratory quotient decreases during sleep, indicating a shift from carbohydrate oxidation toward fat oxidation. The nadir, the point of maximum fat burning, typically occurs in the middle of the night. Free fatty acid levels in the blood show this same pattern. They're low at the start of sleep, rise during the middle of the night, and then decline again toward morning. This transient increase isn't dysfunction. It's the body accessing its energy stores, burning fat to fuel the metabolic processes that continue during sleep. Growth hormone plays a critical role here. Released in pulses during deep sleep, particularly in the first few hours of the night, growth hormone promotes lipolysis. It signals fat cells to break down triglycerides and release free fatty acids. It helps preserve lean muscle mass so that the energy mobilized comes from fat stores rather than from breaking down protein. Research at the University of California, Berkeley has shown that growth hormone not only helps build muscle and bone and reduce fat tissue, but it also regulates glucose and fat metabolism at a fundamental level. Insufficient sleep lowers growth hormone release, and when growth hormone is reduced, the body's ability to efficiently burn fat during this overnight fast is compromised. What makes this particularly important is that this overnight fat-burning window isn't optional. It's not a bonus feature. It's a fundamental part of how your body maintains metabolic balance. This pattern appears to be deeply integrated into human metabolism. The extended fast of sleep, the shift to fat oxidation, the mobilization and utilization of stored energy. This is how your body functions when given the time to complete its processes. When sleep is cut short, this process gets truncated. You wake up before your body has fully completed its overnight metabolic work. The transition to fat burning either doesn't occur or is incomplete. Your body doesn't get the full benefit of that fat oxidation phase. And come morning, you're starting the day not from a place of metabolic completion, but from a place of metabolic interruption. Even more concerning, chronic sleep restriction appears to train the body to be less metabolically flexible. That's the term researchers use for the ability to switch efficiently between burning carbohydrates and burning fat, depending on what's available. Metabolically flexible individuals can shift fuel sources easily. They can fast without difficulty because their body readily accesses fat stores. They can eat carbohydrates without dramatic blood sugar swings because their system efficiently utilizes glucose. Sleep-deprived individuals show reduced metabolic flexibility. Their bodies struggle to make that transition from carbohydrate to fat burning. Even during an overnight fast, even when conditions should favor fat oxidation, their systems remain more reliant on glucose. This pattern suggests they wake up with greater hunger, with more urgency to replenish glucose stores, with a body that's less comfortable accessing its own fat for fuel. The programming happened during sleep. Or rather, it failed to happen because sleep was insufficient. This overnight metabolic shift has profound implications that extend beyond a single night. When you consistently truncate this process, when you habitually wake up before your body completes its fat-burning phase, you're training your metabolism to remain less flexible. You're teaching your body that it can't rely on extended periods of fat oxidation, so it adapts by becoming more dependent on frequent glucose intake. You wake up hungrier. You need breakfast immediately. You experience energy crashes mid-morning if you try to fast. This isn't discipline failing. This is metabolic adaptation to a pattern of interrupted, overnight fat burning. The beauty of understanding this mechanism is that it's reversible. When you consistently allow adequate sleep, when you give your body the full 7 to 9 hours to complete its metabolic work, that overnight fat-burning window extends and deepens. Your body relearns that it can rely on accessing fat stores. Metabolic flexibility improves. Morning hunger becomes less urgent. The desperate need for immediate food upon waking softens. Your system recalibrates to what it was designed to do, cycling efficiently between fed and fasted states, between glucose and fat as fuel sources. Research examining metabolic flexibility during sleep has found sex differences that are particularly illuminating. Women tend to reach the nadir of their respiratory quotient. the point of maximum fat oxidation earlier in the night than men. This suggests that the temporal pattern of fat burning during sleep may vary between individuals, influenced by hormones, body composition, and metabolic characteristics. What remains consistent across all individuals, however, is that the process requires time. It requires uninterrupted sleep. It requires allowing the body to progress through its natural metabolic phases without artificial truncation. Consider what happens when this process is repeatedly disrupted over weeks and months. The immediate consequence is that each day begins from a place of metabolic disadvantage. But the cumulative effect is more insidious. Your baseline metabolic state shifts. What was once a temporary perturbation becomes the new normal. Insulin resistance that was acute becomes chronic. Reduced leptin that was situational becomes persistent. Elevated ghrelin that followed bad sleep becomes your default appetite signal. The body, remarkably adaptive, adjusts to operating in this compromised state. And paradoxically, this adaptation makes the situation harder to reverse because your system no longer recognizes the dysfunction as abnormal. This is perhaps the most important revelation about overnight metabolism and sleep. It's not that one bad night ruins everything, it's that patterns of insufficient sleep create metabolic programming that compounds over time, making each subsequent day progressively harder, each dietary intervention progressively less effective, each attempt at fat loss progressively more frustrating. You're not failing at the same task repeatedly. The task itself is getting harder because the metabolic foundation upon which success depends is eroding with each night of inadequate sleep. The circadian conductor. We need to understand something fundamental about timing. Your body doesn't just run on a sleep-wake cycle, it runs on an intricate circadian system, a biological clock that governs when different metabolic processes should occur, when hormones should peak and trough, when your body should be primed for eating versus fasting, for activity versus rest, for building versus breaking down. This circadian system is composed of a master clock, located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, a tiny cluster of neurons that receives light information from your eyes and coordinates your body's daily rhythms. But there are also peripheral clocks, molecular oscillators in nearly every cell of your body, especially in metabolically active tissues like the liver, pancreas, muscle, and fat cells. These clocks work through what scientists call transcriptional-translational feedback loops. Essentially, certain genes turn on and off in roughly 24-hour cycles, and these gene expression rhythms control when enzymes for fat storage are produced, when proteins for glucose metabolism are available, when hormones are released, when your body is receptive or resistant to different metabolic signals. The clock genes have names: BMAL1, clock, PERCRY, REV-ERB. They sound like science fiction, but they're fundamental to your daily metabolic rhythm. And sleep is the primary synchronizer of these peripheral clocks. Studies have shown that when people experience circadian misalignment, when their sleep-wake cycle is out of sync with their internal biological time, glucose tolerance deteriorates, insulin sensitivity decreases, the risk of metabolic syndrome increases. But this isn't just about when you sleep. It's about how sleep coordinates all the peripheral clocks throughout your body. Think of it like an orchestra. The master clock in your hypothalamus is the conductor. Sleep is the downbeat that synchronizes all the instruments. When sleep is regular, adequate, and aligned with your circadian rhythm, all the peripheral clocks in your metabolic tissues play in harmony. Fat cells know when to store and when to release. Liver cells know when to produce glucose and when to be suppressed by insulin. Pancreatic beta cells know when to be maximally responsive to blood sugar and when to rest. When sleep is disrupted, the orchestra falls out of sync. Different sections are playing at different tempos. The result is metabolic discord. Research on clock genes has revealed something fascinating. In mice and increasingly in human studies, the amplitude of clock gene expression, how strongly they oscillate between active and inactive states, is directly affected by sleep quality. High-fat diets and irregular eating can dampen these oscillations, but time-restricted eating confined to the active period can restore them. Similarly, adequate sleep during the appropriate circadian phase appears essential for maintaining robust clock gene rhythms. When these rhythms are strong and coordinated, metabolism hums along efficiently. When they're weakened or desynchronized, metabolic efficiency suffers. Fat oxidation becomes less rhythmic. Glucose tolerance becomes less predictable. The body loses that temporal precision that allows it to anticipate meals, prepare for activity, optimize fat burning during fasts. Sleep, especially sleep that occurs at the right biological time, is what keeps this system synchronized. And that synchronization, established during the night, determines how effectively your metabolic machinery operates the following day. The research on peripheral clocks in adipose tissue is particularly revealing. Fat cells themselves contain circadian clocks that regulate when they should be storing lipids and when they should be releasing them. Studies have found that when these adipocyte clocks are disrupted, either through genetic manipulation in mice or through irregular feeding and sleep patterns in humans, thermogenesis decreases. That's the body's heat-generating, calorie-burning capacity. In controlled studies, mice lacking functional clock genes in their fat cells show reduced weight loss even on calorie-restricted diets and show blunted increases in metabolic rate when food intake is timed appropriately. What's fascinating is that the amplitude of these clock gene oscillations in fat tissue correlates with metabolic health. When BMAL equals 1, one of the master clock proteins is highly expressed in adipocytes and showing strong rhythmic oscillation, thermogenesis is enhanced. Creatine cycling, a metabolic pathway that burns energy to generate heat, shows strong circadian rhythm. Weight gain on high-fat diets is attenuated. Research suggests that fat cells themselves, when their internal clocks are running properly, become more metabolically active, more responsive to hormonal signals, more efficient at releasing stored energy when appropriate. This means that adequate sleep doesn't just prevent metabolic damage. It actively optimizes the function of your fat tissue. When you sleep consistently and well, when your circadian system is properly synchronized, your fat cells become better at their job, not just storing when food is abundant, but releasing when fasting, not just sitting passively, but actively participating in metabolic regulation through hormone secretion, thermogenesis, and responsive lipolysis. The liver clock operates similarly. Hepatic clock genes regulate when the liver should be producing glucose endogenously to maintain blood sugar during fasting, and when it should be suppressing that production in response to insulin after meals. This is what researchers call hepatic insulin sensitivity, the liver's ability to respond appropriately to insulin's signal to stop making glucose. Research has shown that this hepatic insulin sensitivity peaks in the early morning, right around the time people typically eat breakfast, in anticipation of that meal. This anticipatory regulation is critical. The liver isn't just responding to meals reactively. Based on circadian programming, it's preparing in advance, priming itself to efficiently handle incoming glucose, to respond promptly to insulin, to make the transition from fasting metabolism to fed metabolism smoothly. When sleep is adequate and timed properly, this anticipatory mechanism works beautifully. The liver is ready. When sleep is disrupted, when circadian timing is off, this anticipation fails. The liver remains in fasting mode even as food arrives. It continues producing glucose even as dietary glucose floods in. This pattern can result in postprandial hyperglycemia, elevated blood sugar after meals, because the liver's clock wasn't properly cued to make the metabolic shift. Skeletal muscle also has peripheral clocks that govern when muscle cells should be maximally responsive to insulin, when they should be taking up glucose most efficiently, when they should be oxidizing fat versus carbohydrate. Research using the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp to measure tissue-specific insulin sensitivity has found that muscle insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning and lowest at night. This is why identical meals consumed at different times of day produce different glucose responses. Not because the food changed, but because the muscle's readiness to process that food varied based on circadian timing. The pancreas, too, operates on a circadian rhythm. Beta cells that secrete insulin show rhythmic changes in their responsiveness to glucose. Their capacity for insulin secretion peaks in the early part of the day and declines toward evening. This is why glucose tolerance tests show better results in morning versus evening. The pancreas is literally more capable of mounting an appropriate insulin response earlier in the day, when its circadian clock says it's feeding time, than it is later in the day when circadian programming says it should be fasting. All of these tissue-specific clocks, liver, muscle, fat, pancreas, they're coordinated by sleep. When sleep is regular, adequate, and properly timed, all these clocks stay synchronized with each other and with the master clock in the hypothalamus. They play in harmony. Meals are anticipated. Glucose is processed efficiently. Fat is mobilized appropriately. Hormones peak and trough at optimal times. The result is metabolic efficiency that you experience as stable energy, manageable hunger, and a body that responds predictably to dietary choices. When sleep is disrupted, these clocks desynchronize. The liver clock might think it's time to produce glucose, while the muscle clock thinks it's time to take up glucose. The fat clock might be in storage mode, while hormonal signals say it should be in release mode. The pancreas might be ramping down insulin secretion just as a meal arrives that requires robust insulin response. This temporal chaos doesn't just make metabolism less efficient. It creates a physiological environment where fat loss becomes extraordinarily difficult because the coordination required for effective fat mobilization and oxidation simply isn't there. The implications are profound. You could follow the same diet, consume the same calories, engage in the same physical activity, but if your circadian clocks are desynchronized due to poor sleep or irregular sleep timing, your metabolic outcomes will be substantially worse than if those clocks were synchronized. The components are the same, but the timing is off. And in metabolism, timing is everything. This is why shift workers, despite often consuming no more calories than day workers, show higher rates of obesity, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes. Not because they're eating differently, but because their sleep-wake cycle is perpetually misaligned with their circadian biology. Their peripheral clocks never properly synchronize. They're trying to sleep when their body thinks it should be active, and trying to be active when their body thinks it should be sleeping. Every meal is consumed at the wrong circadian time. Every bout of insulin secretion is fighting against circadian programming that says it's the wrong moment. The metabolic machinery is constantly working at cross purposes with itself. For those of us not working night shifts, the lesson is clear. Irregular sleep schedules, even if total sleep time is adequate, can create similar desynchrony. Going to bed at midnight one night and 10 p.m. the next, waking at 7 on weekdays and 10 on weekends, this variability disrupts the synchronization of peripheral clocks. Each tissue is trying to anticipate your schedule, trying to optimize its metabolic function for the patterns you establish. But when those patterns keep changing, the clocks can't lock on. They drift. They lose amplitude. The rhythmic precision that enables optimal metabolism degrades into metabolic confusion. Sleep, consistent and adequate sleep at consistent times, is the synchronizing cue that keeps all these clocks aligned. It's not about rigidity or perfectionism. It's about providing your body with reliable information so that its metabolic systems can anticipate and prepare rather than constantly reacting and adjusting. When circadian clocks are well synchronized, metabolism hums along with an efficiency that makes fat loss and metabolic health far more attainable. When they're desynchronized, even the best dietary interventions face an uphill battle against a body that's fundamentally confused about what time it is and what it should be doing. The cortisol morning. Let's talk specifically about what happens in the hour after you wake up, because this is where the programming of the previous night becomes immediately apparent. There's a phenomenon called the cortisol awakening response. In many individuals, cortisol levels increase sharply in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking, typically rising between 38 and 75%. This isn't a stress response in the negative sense. It's the body transitioning from sleep to wakefulness, mobilizing energy, sharpening attention, preparing for the demands of the day. But the magnitude and pattern of this cortisol awakening response is heavily influenced by sleep quality. Studies have found that people who wake up early, particularly those on early morning shifts, often show a greater and more prolonged cortisol awakening response than those who wake later. However, when researchers controlled for sleep quality and stress levels, they found that the increased cortisol response wasn't really about the act of waking up itself. It was about sleep disturbance and the stress of inadequate rest preceding an early wake time. Other research has shown that the timing of the cortisol peak relative to awakening is influenced by how long you slept. People who slept longer, around 9 hours, showed their peak cortisol levels well before they actually woke up, during the late part of their sleep. People who slept shorter, around 6 hours, showed their peak after waking. This matters because cortisol directly affects metabolism. Elevated cortisol promotes insulin resistance. It encourages the breakdown of muscle tissue for energy. It increases appetite, particularly for high-calorie foods. It shifts the body toward storage mode rather than burning mode. When you wake up with cortisol levels that are dysregulated, either chronically elevated from poor sleep or showing an exaggerated awakening response, you're starting the day in a state of metabolic disadvantage. Your insulin sensitivity is already compromised. Your appetite hormones are already skewed. Your body is already primed to store rather than burn. Research has demonstrated this directly. Sleep restriction increases evening cortisol levels, which remain elevated through the night. This means cortisol never drops to the low levels it should reach during sleep. Come morning, that baseline is higher. The signal that should tell your body it's time to be alert and active is already partially spent. And that elevated baseline cortisol, persisting from inadequate sleep, impairs morning insulin sensitivity. Studies measuring insulin sensitivity in the morning after varying amounts of sleep have consistently found this pattern. The poorer the sleep, the higher the morning cortisol, the lower the insulin sensitivity. This isn't a delayed effect that builds over weeks. This is an immediate consequence. Last night's sleep determined this morning's cortisol profile, which determined this morning's metabolic state. When you eat breakfast, your body's response to that meal, how efficiently it processes the glucose, how much insulin it needs to secrete, how stable your blood sugar remains over the next few hours, all of that was influenced by the cortisol environment established during and immediately after sleep. The day's metabolic trajectory set in motion by sleep or the lack thereof. The predictive eating. Here's where everything converges into something tangible, something you experience directly, even if you don't understand the mechanisms underneath. The way you eat today was predicted by how you slept last night. Researchers studying the relationship between sleep and eating behavior have used ecological momentary assessment, essentially tracking people's sleep with devices, and then asking them throughout the day about their hunger, cravings, and food choices. What they've found is a clear temporal relationship. Night-to-night variations in sleep duration and quality predict next-day food cravings and eating behavior. One study in youth found that on mornings after less sleep than their personal average, participants reported stronger food cravings. The less sleep relative to their individual norm, the stronger the desire for food. This wasn't about calories consumed the previous day. This wasn't about how much they exercised. This was purely sleep-predicting appetite. Other research using experimental sleep restriction followed participants over several days. After 4 nights of restricted sleep to 4 hours, subjects were offered an array of snack foods. Despite having eaten a large meal less than 2 hours before, they had significant difficulty limiting their snack consumption. They chose foods that provided 50% more calories than when they were well rested, including twice the amount of fat. The timing of these effects is revealing. The largest impact of sleep loss on food choices appears to occur during the late afternoon and evening. That's when the sleep debt of the previous night manifests most strongly in altered eating behavior. That's when people reach for snacks despite not being truly hungry. That's when portion sizes increase. That's when calorie-dense foods become irresistible. Brain imaging studies have shown why. During the late afternoon and evening after sleep deprivation, the brain's response to food cues remains heightened. The amygdala stays activated. The prefrontal cortex stays suppressed. The chemical signature of sleep loss, particularly the elevated endocannabinoid levels that were measured after restricted sleep, these levels peak in the early afternoon and remain elevated through the evening. This creates a window of maximum vulnerability, a window where hedonic eating for pleasure rather than need, becomes almost impossible to resist. Studies tracking this phenomenon found that sleep-deprived individuals didn't report feeling hungrier overall. They weren't walking around with their stomachs growling. But when presented with palatable food, particularly energy-dense food, they consistently chose more of it. The researchers described it as an amplification of the hedonic drive for food. This suggests that sleep deprivation doesn't make you hungry in the traditional sense. It makes rewarding food more rewarding. It makes pleasure-signaling food more compelling. It shifts the balance so that while you might know intellectually that you've eaten enough, the satisfaction signal never quite arrives with the same strength. This is programming manifesting as behavior. The neurochemical state established by last night's sleep is now expressing itself as food choices, portion sizes, snack decisions that feel autonomous but are actually highly predictable based on the metabolic and neural environment created by sleep quality. The endocannabinoid system's role here deserves deeper examination because it reveals just how mechanistic the relationship between sleep and food choices actually is. Research has found that sleep restriction leads to elevated levels of 2-AG, 2-oleoylglycerol, an endocannabinoid molecule that acts on the same receptors that are activated by marijuana. This isn't metaphorical. Poor sleep literally activates the same neurochemical pathways that create the munchies. Studies measuring 2 Ag levels across the day have shown that these levels normally rise gradually during waking hours, peak in early afternoon around 12:30 p.m., and then decline. But in sleep-deprived individuals, 2 Ag levels rise higher and remain elevated well into the evening, several hours beyond their typical peak. This extended elevation creates an extended window of enhanced hedonic eating drive. Food doesn't just look appealing, it looks irresistible. The pleasure signaling associated with eating is amplified. The satisfaction threshold is raised. You need more food, more intensely flavored food, more calorie-dense food to achieve the same level of reward satisfaction that would normally come from modest portions of ordinary food. The piriform cortex, the brain region responsible for processing food-related smells, shows increased activity in sleep-deprived individuals when exposed to food odors. This heightened sensitivity to food cues means that the smell of coffee brewing, of bread baking, of any palatable food becomes more salient, more attention-grabbing, more likely to trigger eating behavior even in the absence of genuine hunger. Your sensory processing of food is literally enhanced by sleep deprivation, making your environment feel more filled with food temptations than it actually is. Research examining eye tracking during food choices has found that sleep-deprived individuals show altered gaze patterns when making decisions between high-calorie and low-calorie foods. They spend less time looking back and forth between options, suggesting reduced internal conflict, reduced deliberation. The choice feels more automatic, more intuitive, less like a decision that requires careful consideration. This is the impaired prefrontal cortex manifesting behaviorally. The mechanism that would normally generate "should I eat this?" instead generates "yes, eat this" almost immediately. The timing pattern of these vulnerabilities is not random. Multiple studies have found that the late afternoon and early evening represent maximum risk periods for sleep-deprived individuals to overconsume calories. This is when the combined effects of elevated endocannabinoids, heightened amygdala response to food cues, reduced prefrontal control, and accumulated fatigue from the day converge to create what researchers describe as a perfect storm for hedonic eating. It's not coincidental that this is also when many people report their greatest struggles with dietary adherence. These struggles aren't failures of character. They're predictable consequences of a brain operating in a neurochemical environment shaped by insufficient sleep. Interestingly, hunger itself, measured subjectively through visual analog scales, doesn't always correlate strongly with actual food intake in sleep-deprived individuals. Some studies have found that sleep-restricted participants don't report feeling significantly hungrier than well-rested participants, yet they consume more calories anyway. This dissociation between reported hunger and actual consumption suggests that sleep deprivation isn't primarily affecting homeostatic eating driven by genuine energy need. It's affecting hedonic eating driven by pleasure and reward anticipation. You're not eating because you're hungry. You're eating because food is rewarding, and you're neurochemically primed to seek reward. The food preferences that emerge under sleep deprivation are also telling. It's not that sleep-deprived people want more of everything. They specifically want more energy-dense foods, more fat, more refined carbohydrates, more combinations of fat and sugar that maximize both energy density and reward potential. When offered a buffet, sleep-deprived participants gravitating toward glazed donuts over blueberry muffins isn't a coincidence. The donut has more calories per gram, more immediate glucose availability, more fat to signal satiety while somehow not actually satiating. It's the perfect storm of properties that light up a reward-seeking brain operating with reduced impulse control. Some research has even shown that sleep-deprived individuals choose smaller portions of low-energy foods. Not only are they drawn to high-calorie options, they're actively avoiding or minimizing low-calorie options. The decreased liking for low-energy foods appears to be just as important as increased desire for high-energy foods. Based on these patterns, your palate shifts. Vegetables seem less appealing. Salads feel unsatisfying before you even take a bite. The reward prediction your brain makes when considering these foods is diminished, so the motivation to eat them collapses. Meanwhile, the reward prediction for pizza or cookies or chips is amplified, so motivation to eat those foods soars. This creates a nightmarish situation for anyone trying to maintain healthy eating patterns. It's not just that willpower is reduced. Your perceptual and motivational relationship with food itself has been altered at a neurochemical level. The foods you know you should eat seem less appealing. The foods you know you should moderate seem more appealing. And your capacity to override this shift, to eat according to plan rather than according to craving, is simultaneously impaired by prefrontal dysfunction. You're fighting a battle on multiple fronts, all disadvantages created by a single night of poor sleep. The predictability of this is perhaps what's most striking from a practical standpoint. If you know you slept poorly last night, you can predict with reasonable accuracy that sometime between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. today, you will face intensified cravings for high-calorie foods. You can predict that your decision-making around food will be compromised. You can predict that portions that normally satisfy you will feel insufficient. You can predict that foods you normally find easy to resist will feel compelling. This isn't uncertainty. It's programming expressing itself on a predictable timeline. Does knowing this make it easier? Sometimes. Awareness can create a small buffer, a moment of recognition where you think, this is the sleep deprivation talking, not actual hunger. But awareness alone isn't always enough to overcome neurochemistry. The prefrontal cortex insight that recognizes the pattern is still the same prefrontal cortex that's functioning at reduced capacity. You can see through the trap and still step into it because the machinery required to avoid the trap is impaired by the same process that made the trap irresistible in the first place. This is why prevention through adequate sleep is so much more effective than trying to overcome these effects through willpower once they're already in motion. It's far easier to sleep 7 to 9 hours and wake up with normal leptin, normal ghrelin, normal endocannabinoid levels, and normal prefrontal function than it is to sleep 5 hours and then try to resist the predictable cascade of cravings and impaired decision-making that follows. One is working with your biology, the other is fighting it. The recovery question. One question inevitably arises: can you recover? If you sleep poorly for a few nights and your metabolism shifts, your hormones dysregulate, your insulin sensitivity drops, can you fix it with a good night's sleep or two? The research here offers both hope and caution. Some effects reverse relatively quickly. Studies have shown that leptin and ghrelin levels can normalize after 2 nights of recovery sleep following 2 nights of restriction. Subjective hunger decreases. Food cravings diminish. The acute hormonal perturbations created by short-term sleep loss appear to be reversible with adequate rest. Insulin sensitivity shows a similar pattern, but with a longer recovery window. Research indicates that oral insulin sensitivity can return to baseline after 3 days of 9-hour sleep opportunities following 5 days of restricted sleep. However, intravenous insulin sensitivity, a more direct measure, required longer than 5 days of recovery to fully normalize. This suggests that while some aspects of metabolic function bounce back relatively quickly, deeper disruptions may take longer to resolve. The implications here are significant for anyone following a pattern of weekday sleep restriction with weekend catch-up sleep. Yes, recovery sleep helps. Yes, some of the damage is reversible, but it may not completely erase the metabolic burden accumulated during the week. The body doesn't operate on a simple banking system where you can withdraw sleep during the week and deposit it on weekends with no consequences. More concerning is what happens with chronic, repeated cycles of sleep restriction and partial recovery. The research on recurrent partial sleep deprivation suggests that the body's ability to maintain normal, slow-wave sleep and growth hormone release becomes blunted. In other words, after repeated cycles of insufficient sleep, even when you get more sleep, the quality and architecture of that sleep may be compromised. The evidence indicates you don't bounce back to baseline as completely. The rebound that occurs after acute sleep loss doesn't happen with the same vigor after chronic sleep loss. This appears to represent the body adapting to a new normal, a less optimal normal, a metabolic baseline that's shifted in ways that make fat loss harder, muscle preservation more difficult, appetite regulation more chaotic. The programming, repeated over and over, becomes semi-permanent, not irreversible, but increasingly resistant to change. The more consistently you undermine your sleep, the more entrenched the metabolic dysfunction becomes, the harder it is to restore optimal function even when you finally prioritize rest. The decision point. So where does this leave us? We started in darkness with an alarm that hasn't sounded yet, with a body making calculations in the background, with a day already being decided by processes most people never consider. And now we understand what those processes are. We understand the hormone conference that happens in the absence of adequate sleep. We understand the neurological shift that makes food irresistible. We understand the insulin resistance, the blunted fat burning, the dysregulated cortisol, the disrupted circadian clocks, the predictable food choices that feel like personal failure, but are actually biological consequences. We understand that sleep isn't passive recovery. It's active programming. It's when your body sets the parameters for the following day's metabolism. It's when hormones are calibrated, when neural pathways are refreshed, when metabolic flexibility is maintained, when circadian clocks are synchronized, when fat burning occurs, when growth hormone sculpts your body composition. When sleep is adequate, regular, and aligned with your natural circadian rhythm, this programming runs cleanly. Your body wakes up metabolically prepared. Insulin sensitivity is high. Leptin and Ghrelin are balanced. Your brain's decision-making centers are fully online. Your cells are synchronized to anticipate meals, to efficiently process nutrients, to readily access fat stores when needed. You don't feel this directly. You simply notice that hunger is manageable, that cravings are mild, that the same foods that might tempt you when you're tired seem less compelling when you're rested. That discipline feels natural rather than like swimming against current. You attribute this to motivation or willpower, but beneath the surface, it's biology. It's the program running correctly. When sleep is insufficient, fragmented, or mistimed, the program corrupts. The code contains errors. The instructions your cells receive are garbled. Insulin sensitivity drops by 25%. Leptin falls by 18%. Ghrelin surges by 28%. Cortisol remains elevated. Growth hormone release is suppressed. Prefrontal cortex activity decreases while amygdala activity increases. Metabolic flexibility diminishes. fat oxidation slows. Food cravings intensify, particularly for high-calorie options that seem to promise quick energy and reward. You experience this as weakness, as lack of discipline, as another failed attempt to stick to a diet. But it's not weakness. It's biochemistry. It's your body operating with a corrupted program, making decisions based on faulty information, trying to solve a metabolic problem that was created not by your food choices, but by your sleep deficit. This is why every diet that ignores sleep is built on sand. You can count calories meticulously. You can eliminate entire food groups. You can white-knuckle your way through cravings and force yourself through workouts. But if your sleep remains disrupted, if the underlying metabolic program continues to run with errors, you're fighting an uphill battle with a body that's been biochemically primed to resist fat loss, amplify hunger, and seek out calorie-dense foods. The research couldn't be clearer. Sleep restriction, even modest sleep restriction, even for just a few days, fundamentally alters metabolism. It creates insulin resistance. It disrupts appetite hormones. It impairs the neural machinery of self-control. It shifts the body toward storage rather than burning. It makes fat loss physiologically harder, not because you're weak or unmotivated, but because the cellular environment no longer favors it. And all of this is decided before you wake up. The practical reality. Understanding this creates both liberation and responsibility. Liberation because so much of what we blame ourselves for, what we interpret as personal failure, is actually biological programming running its course. The 3 p.m. craving for cookies after a bad night's sleep isn't a character flaw. It's elevated ghrelin, reduced leptin, a hyperresponsive amygdala, and an impaired prefrontal cortex creating a neurochemical state that makes resistance extraordinarily difficult. But also responsibility. Because if sleep decides metabolic outcomes with such precision, if the quality and quantity of last night's rest determines today's hunger, insulin sensitivity, fat-burning capacity, and food choices, then sleep becomes non-negotiable. Not a luxury. Not something you optimize after you've handled everything else. Sleep is the foundation, the program that writes all other programs. This doesn't mean sleep alone solves everything. You still need to eat appropriately. You still benefit from movement, from strength training, from managing stress. But none of those things work optimally. None of them create sustainable fat loss and metabolic health if the underlying sleep program is corrupted. Think of it this way. You can have the perfect nutrition plan, but if you're only sleeping 5 hours a night, your body will respond to that nutrition with insulin resistance, elevated cortisol, and dysregulated appetite hormones. The food itself hasn't changed, but your body's capacity to process it properly has been compromised by sleep deprivation. You can have ironclad discipline, but if your prefrontal cortex is operating at reduced capacity due to insufficient sleep, that discipline will feel like trying to hold back a river. You might succeed for a while through sheer force of will, but the biological pressure, the neurochemical drive toward calorie-dense food, will eventually overwhelm you. And when it does, you'll blame yourself for lacking willpower, never realizing that your brain's decision-making architecture was structurally impaired by sleep loss. You can exercise religiously, but if your sleep is disrupted, your growth hormone release is blunted, your overnight fat burning is curtailed, and your body's ability to recover from training is compromised. The training stimulus remains the same, but the adaptive response, the growth and fat loss that should follow, is muted because the hormonal environment created by poor sleep doesn't favor it. Every intervention, Every effort to improve body composition and metabolic health operates within the parameters established by sleep. When those parameters are optimal, effort yields results. When those parameters are disrupted, the same effort produces disappointingly modest outcomes, or no outcomes at all, or outcomes that reverse as soon as vigilance wavers. This is why sleep comes first. Why it's not just another variable to optimize eventually. It's the variable that determines how effectively all other variables can work, adults. The morning choice. The alarm sounds now, not the imaginary one from our opening, but the real one. The one that marks the boundary between sleeping and waking, between the programming that occurred in darkness and the day that will unfold in light. Your feet touch the floor, and in this moment, before breakfast, before any conscious decision about food or exercise or discipline, your body already exists in a particular metabolic state. A state determined by what happened while you were unconscious. If sleep was adequate, your insulin sensitivity is high. If it wasn't, you're already resistant. If sleep was deep and complete, your leptin levels are appropriate, and your ghrelin is in check. If it wasn't, you're hormonally primed for hunger and craving. If sleep restored your prefrontal cortex function, you can make rational choices about food today. If it didn't, your amygdala is hypersensitive to reward, and your decision-making is compromised. The metabolic trajectory of the entire day was set in those hours you can't remember. The fat you'll burn or fail to burn, the hunger you'll experience or won't experience, the food choices that will feel easy or impossibly difficult. All of it, programmed in darkness. This is what we mean when we say sleep decides fat loss before the day begins. Not that sleep alone creates fat loss, but that sleep creates the metabolic and neural environment within which fat loss becomes possible or impossible. Sleep sets the stage. It writes the code. It programs the hormones, the insulin sensitivity, the appetite signals, the brain chemistry that will govern every subsequent choice. You can override this programming, temporarily, through sheer determination, through carefully controlling your environment, through monitoring every bite. But override is exhausting. Override requires constant vigilance. Override is what happens when you're fighting your biology instead of working with it. When sleep is right, you're not overriding anything. You're simply living in a body that's metabolically prepared to burn fat, resist cravings, make reasonable food choices, and feel satisfied with appropriate portions. The program is running cleanly. The biology is aligned. What looks like discipline is actually just a body operating with correctly calibrated systems. This is the uncomfortable truth that changes everything once you truly absorb it. You can't out-discipline bad sleep. You can't out-diet it. You can't out-exercise it. Those things matter, but they matter within the context of the metabolic program established by sleep. When that program is corrupted, everything else becomes exponentially harder. And when that program runs cleanly, everything else becomes possible. The path forward. So, what does this mean practically? How do you use this understanding? First, recognize that sleep is not auxiliary. It's not the thing you address after you've perfected your diet and exercise. It's the foundation, the prerequisite, the primary lever. If your sleep is compromised, if you're consistently getting less than 7 hours, if the sleep you're getting is fragmented or poorly timed, addressing that becomes the priority. Not just equal priority alongside other health factors. The priority. Second, understand that sleep debt is metabolic debt. Those nights where you stay up late scrolling, those mornings where you cut sleep short to fit in more productivity, those aren't isolated incidents without consequence. Each episode of insufficient sleep is programming the next day's metabolism for dysfunction. Elevated ghrelin, reduced leptin, insulin resistance, impaired fat burning, heightened food cravings. You're not just tired, you're metabolically compromised. Third, recognize the signals. When you wake up after poor sleep and spend the entire day battling hunger, reaching for snacks, craving carbohydrates, struggling with decisions around food, that's not a failure of discipline. That's your body operating exactly as it's programmed to operate after inadequate rest. The hunger is real. The cravings are biochemically driven. Your willpower isn't weak. Your prefrontal cortex is literally functioning at reduced capacity. Understanding this doesn't make the cravings disappear, but it removes the layer of self-blame that makes the experience even more difficult. Fourth, prioritize consistency. Your circadian system, those clock genes that govern metabolic timing, they thrive on regularity. Going to bed and waking up at roughly the same time, even on weekends, keeps those peripheral clocks synchronized. It maintains the rhythmic precision that allows optimal insulin sensitivity in the morning, efficient glucose processing after breakfast, proper fat oxidation during overnight fasts. Irregular sleep, even if total hours are adequate, can create circadian misalignment that disrupts metabolism just as surely as sleep deprivation does. Fifth, respect sleep architecture. It's not just about hours, it's about cycling through the stages properly. Reaching deep, slow-wave sleep where growth hormone is released. Completing enough REM cycles where brain restoration occurs. Avoiding disruptions that fragment sleep and prevent these deeper stages from manifesting. Alcohol before bed might help you fall asleep faster, but it suppresses REM and disrupts architecture. Screens late at night might feel benign, but they shift your circadian rhythm and delay sleep onset. These aren't minor factors. They're programming your metabolic function for the following day. Finally, understand that recovery is real but limited. A few good nights of sleep can restore some of the hormonal balance disrupted by a few bad nights. But chronic sleep restriction, week after week, creates metabolic alterations that don't fully reverse with weekend recovery. The body adapts to the new normal. The baseline shifts. Fat loss becomes not just temporarily harder, but persistently harder. Appetite regulation becomes not just acutely disrupted, but chronically dysregulated. You can fix this. You can restore optimal metabolic function, but it requires sustained commitment to adequate sleep, not just occasional catch-up. It requires treating sleep with the same non-negotiable priority you'd give to breathing or eating. Because at a biochemical level, sleep is just as fundamental to survival, to thriving, to maintaining the body you want. The closing. We return to the beginning. To that moment in darkness when your eyes opened at 3:47 and sleep slipped away. To that recognition, felt but not understood, that the day was already decided. Now, you understand what that means. Not fate, not predestination, but biology, programming, the establishment of hormonal, neural, and metabolic conditions that will make certain outcomes likely and others improbable. Your body, operating on the information gathered during sleep or the absence thereof, makes decisions. It decides whether insulin will work efficiently or struggle. It decides whether leptin will signal satiety or broadcast famine. It decides whether ghrelin will remain quiet or insist on feeding. It decides whether your prefrontal cortex will be fully functional or impaired. It decides whether growth hormone will promote fat burning and muscle preservation or be suppressed. It decides whether your circadian clocks will stay synchronized or drift into dysfunction. It decides whether you'll wake up in a body primed to burn fat or one primed to store it. All of these decisions, made in darkness, all of these outcomes, programmed by processes you'll never consciously experience. This is why sleep decides fat loss before the day begins. Not because sleep directly burns fat, though it does. Not because sleep directly suppresses appetite, though it does. But because sleep establishes the entire metabolic and neural framework within which all your daily choices occur. It sets the difficulty level. It loads the parameters. It determines whether fat loss will be possible or impossibly hard. When you're struggling, when every diet fails, when discipline seems impossible, when hunger feels insatiable, when cravings dominate your thoughts, when the scale won't budge despite your efforts, the answer isn't more restriction, more willpower, more self-flagellation. The answer is simpler and more fundamental. The answer is sleep, the program that writes all other programs, the foundation that makes everything else possible, the nightly reset that determines whether tomorrow will be a day of metabolic advantage or metabolic disadvantage. Your feet touched the floor this morning, carrying the consequences of last night's rest or last night's disruption. Tomorrow morning, they'll touch the floor carrying the consequences of tonight's choice. Every night, you write the code. Every morning, that code executes. The question isn't whether sleep decides outcomes. The research is unambiguous. Sleep programs metabolism with precision. The question is whether you'll treat that reality with the seriousness it deserves. Whether you'll prioritize the 8 hours of darkness that determine the success or failure of the 16 hours of light. Whether you'll recognize that everything you want from your body, every goal related to fat loss, every hope for metabolic health, rests on the foundation of adequate, consistent, high-quality sleep. This is After Dark. And the truth, uncomfortable as it may be, is that the darkness matters more than we've been taught. The hours we ignore, the time we dismiss as passive, the state we treat as inconvenient downtime, this is when the most important metabolic programming occurs. This is when your body decides what kind of day you'll have. This is when fat loss becomes possible or impossible. The day isn't decided by your breakfast choice. It's decided by whether you slept deeply enough for growth hormone to be released. It's not decided by your afternoon snack. It's decided by whether your insulin sensitivity was restored during the previous night's rest. It's not decided by your evening workout. It's decided by whether your leptin and ghrelin were properly calibrated during sleep. It's not decided by your discipline. It's decided by whether your prefrontal cortex was given the restoration it needs to function optimally. Every day is an echo of the night that preceded it. Every metabolic outcome, a reflection of the program written in darkness. Sleep well. Not as an afterthought. Not when everything else is handled. Not when you've earned it through productivity. Sleep well because it's the most powerful metabolic tool you possess. Sleep well because the body you want, the fat loss you're chasing, the health you're seeking, all of it begins in the hours you can't remember. Programmed by processes you'll never see. Decided before your alarm ever sounds. The day begins in darkness. Make sure the darkness is deep enough, long enough, and consistent enough to program success. If you found this exploration valuable, if it shifted something in how you understand your own body and the choices that feel difficult, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Optimal Life Project. This is the kind of deep dive content we create, the kind of conversation that looks beyond simple tips and examines the fundamental biology underlying the outcomes we all seek. Share this with someone who's struggling, someone who's been beating themselves up over failed diets and broken discipline, someone who needs to understand that the problem might not be their willpower. It might be their sleep, and that realization could change everything. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. Until next time, sleep well, and let your body do what it's designed to do.